Hello, hello, hello. Hope you're doing very, very well. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. Are we going through the same, not the same nightmare, which we'll talk about, that we've gone through over the last well over a year now? But should we be worried about the way things are heading with COVID-19? Now, if I'm just looking right now at the official government dashboard, in the last week, cases have gone up by 46.2%. The Delta variant, which we originally called the Indian variant, but now the new system, rightly, is Alpha, Beta. I mean, it's optimistic. They think there's only going to be 26 of these variants. But nonetheless, the Delta variant has now become the dominant variant in Britain. Now, this only was first identified 2 months ago in this country. The government failed to put it on the red list because they wanted to negotiate a trade deal with India. And Boris Johnson, of course, was visiting India or planning, he didn't in the end, in order to negotiate that trade deal. Continuing the general theme of this government, a completely self-destructive, on its own terms approach, which is a false dichotomy of it's either the public health crisis or the economy. That if if we lock down, it will damage the economy, and we can't be having that. Which is why we delayed lockdown not once, not twice, but 3 times, all 3 times. And in the end, of course, what actually happens is you end up with the worst of all worlds, because the threat to the economy is the public health crisis, the virus. If you crush the virus, as other countries have done much more effectively, then you have less economic consequences. We've got one of the worst economic consequences, one of the worst death tolls on earth. And the same went with the Delta variant, that because they thought a trade deal was in the offing and they didn't want to damage the prospects of that trade deal, they didn't put India on the red list. And as a consequence, that virus, that strain was allowed to seed across the country and is now the dominant strain. Now, what we know about it so far is, and we'll be talking to an expert, of course, as you probably noticed, I'm not a medical expert, which is why we have medical experts on the show to actually be informed and educated about what they tell us. But we know it is so far more transmissible, and there are worrying questions about how much more severe the illness it produces. On the more positive note, over 76% of the adult population have now had 2 doses. One dose, get that right. Over 76% have had 1 dose of a virus, myself included, 2 weeks ago. And over half the adult population have had 2 doses. And that, of course, is overwhelmingly, that includes older people and people who are vulnerable, people with underlying health conditions that make them more susceptible to severe illness with COVID-19. So I suppose the question is, this race against time, will the surge in cases, that was always going to happen to a degree if you start opening up society and the economy, but then you throw in a more transmissible strain into the mix, not great. But will that crash against a wall of vaccinated bodies? And I mean, there are caveats there. The vaccines are very effective, but there are still a chunk of people who won't be entirely protected even after they've been vaccinated. So there's still a pool in the country. But nonetheless, will that mean that we will be spared the surge in hospitalizations that we went through last April, but of course in January, even worse, and what we've seen in India, which is what happens when a country allows a public health crisis to spiral out of control. And we saw the terrifying, horrible scenes in India as hospitals were overwhelmed. And so the question is, are we going to have Freedom Day, so-called, much vaunted, on the 21st of June, which is only 15 days away, in which supposedly restrictions are almost entirely dropped? Or is that not only going to be pushed back, but are we facing the prospect of even more restrictions being imposed, a reversal of where we are today? So I will be joined just imminently with Professor Deenan Pillay from Independent Sage, who a team of scientists and experts who've been vindicated at every stage of this crisis. If they'd been listened to, we wouldn't have around 150,000 people dead, around 1 in every 443 citizens of this country dead. We wouldn't have had the overwhelming of our hospitals. We wouldn't have had the prolonged restrictions on our freedoms that we suffered, because we didn't get a handle on the virus early enough, and we wouldn't have had the grievous economic consequences to this degree either. We still would have suffered, but we didn't need to suffer this much. And that's why it's important to have people who are vindicated, who were right all along, rather than those who fed advice or propagated ideas which were completely discredited, and yet they're still afforded a public platform to continue those untruths and to claim things which aren't even factually true, such as the media ecosystem that we have in this country. I'm also later joined by James Meadway, who's a brilliant economist, a writer, who'll be talking about the economic and political consequences of COVID-19. Before I bring in the professor, normal housekeeping. If you're not watching through YouTube, it really helps us if you just click on the YouTube link. It just helps the show, and then press like. That takes a second. You've got no excuse not to do that. Press a like below. Helps the algorithm, means more people watch it. Simple as that. And then press subscribe, and then you'll get notifications whenever we do videos. This channel is kept on the road by a team because I'm technologically incompetent. But also, that's how we do these documentaries that we've been doing. You might have seen the one we did in Hartlepool. We've done about the businesses that have exploited the crisis. We did the documentary about how the government at every stage, COVID catastrophe, messed everything up with terrible consequences. We've gone to anti-lockdown protests. We've got a whole range of very exciting documentaries coming up, but they take a lot of time, resources, and money, basically, because we pay union wages. This is a left-wing channel. We don't just speak our principles, we stick by principles. So if you want to support us on Patreon, like £3 or whatever, that will help us do those documentaries and all the exciting things we've got planned. Patreon.com/Joe's84, or you can just put questions, as people like Craig Berkey has done, about, and he's asking about randomizing the distribution of the remaining vaccines to be given even more protection faster. I will put that to the professor. So if you want to put your questions, you can support the show. Also, John McKenzie. I will read out everyone who's supported the show at the end. If you want to put questions, use super chat on, but you have to go through to YouTube, and I'll put your questions to them. That's enough for me. Let us bring in an actual expert, Professor Deenan Pillay. Hello, how you doing, Deenan? Great to see you.
Hi, nice to be with you, Owen. And
I was just talking to Deenan coincidentally, and I completely didn't put two and two together. I went on holiday with his son a couple of weeks ago to Shropshire, which is a lovely little time. He's a great guy, also a medic, so he's a kind of superhero medic family. So just to kick off, thanks again. Obviously, we really appreciate it, especially at short notice. When I look, as I say, you look at the government, the official dashboard, and in normal times, pre-vaccine, if you saw that surge in cases, you'd be going, oh, this is very bad. But we do actually have the only thing that's gone right, and it's not the government who should be credited, it's the NHS vaccine program. Unlike test and trace handed to the private sector, this was run by the public sector. Let's notice the difference. It has been such a success. We should be very proud of it as a country. So I suppose my question is the surge in cases, should we really be that worried? Because maybe it won't translate into hospitalisations and deaths of the sort we've seen of a horrific magnitude.
Yes, good question. I guess we don't know precisely. Clearly, we've learned to our cost that delay in a response to these early indications of an upsurge of infections it is really damaging, because when the virus replicates and transmits, it does so in an exponential way. In other words, if I'm infected and I go into a pub, I will infect two other people, let's say. Those individuals will each infect two other people on average, and so the growth of the virus is exponential. And by the time we in our data we're seeing an increase, then things are well on their way. And that's why we've got to be really careful and cautious about this and respond. But it is fair to say, as you've identified, Owen, that we're in a different situation now at a population level. The last two surges happened where there was no vaccine rollout, and therefore there were lots of people who were susceptible to infection. What immunization has done, it is not only to take out of the susceptible population a large group of individuals, but also attenuate the infection. If, for instance, people have just had one dose, or even if they had two doses, because vaccines are not 100% effective, but nevertheless, the net result is to sort of attenuate the degree to which there will be growth. And that's what is the uncertainty at the moment. And that's why modelers are brought into play to try and predict what is likely to happen. Having said that, we still have half of the adult population who have not had both doses of vaccine. We clearly have the school children issue, and I think it's becoming more and clearer that children have become a sort of reservoir of infections, transmissions. And whilst we can debate about the impact of those infections on children, of course, those children, when schools are open, it's not just about whether those schools are safe. Is that there's a lot of other things happen. Children come home, they're multi-generation households, teachers, etc., people moving around the community. And so that is a real risk at the moment, because of course children are relatively unvaccinated, but also the government has now suggested that and given instruction that secondary school children should not wear masks, and that's one of the things we feel very strongly about within Independence Age, is that schools, whilst not closing, because of course we've got to protect education, need to be as protected as they can in order to ensure that doesn't become the conduit of further transmissions of infection. So all of those things come into play. It's unclear clearly at the moment the degree to which the current surge of low-level surge, but nevertheless surge of infections, will lead to hospitalizations and deaths. There's many different pieces of information circulating around, but the net result of all of this uncertainty has led sort of us within Independence Age to recommend at this stage that we should not be expecting to move ahead on the 21st of June.
Before we talk about the so-called, I suppose, Freedom Day, whatever you want to call it, on the 21st of June, what do we know about the Delta variant? This was, of course, known as the Indian variant. It became very unhelpful, just, people sticking just so where it happens, the country where it's first identified, not even necessarily where it started. Spanish flu, of course, notoriously called Spanish flu, and it almost certainly did not start in Spain. Well, it didn't start in Spain. So tell us about the Delta variant, and what do we know about it in terms of increased, not just transmission, but I suppose more worryingly, more severe illness?
Yes. So, but before I address that, if you don't mind, is something about these variants. There are viruses, every time they transmit, they must replicate, they must make more of themselves, and pretty much all viruses mutate as that happens. And of course, therefore, there's always the capacity for these new variants to develop. We call them variants, but all viruses have mutations, or sometimes just called mutants, sometimes called variants, sometimes called lineages or clades or subtypes of certain viruses. And so it is to be expected that this happens. Now, of course, some of those variants have such an advantage. What I mean an advantage is, in an evolutionary sense, is they will, for instance, preferentially infect compared to another variant. And the reasons why that may be is, for instance, they may, because of mutations, they may bind better to the cell that they infect within your throat or your nose, and that may lead to a higher rate with which that virus replicates. It makes more virus, and therefore, if you're infected with that, you can more easily infect somebody else, because you're breathing out more virus compared to someone who is infected with another variant. So these are all the sort of things that lead to variation. But we now have some clear core variants that seem to take hold and have emerged over time, and we know that this Delta variant, and you're absolutely right, Owen, to sort of highlight the nomenclature here, and even the subtlety of that is that we call variants the Brazilian variant, South African variant, UK variant or Kent variant, and so only because and Indian variant, because these are the places that can actually do the genetic analysis to identify that. But of course, these may have emerged elsewhere. But I'm putting that aside. This Delta variant differs in two ways from previous variants circulating within the UK. One is it appears to transmit more than the previous variant, and the previous variant, the Kent variant, now called the Alpha variant, was itself an upgrade on the very first variant circulating in the world. It transmits more, and we don't know why it transmits more, but clearly some of the mutations in the virus that have led to a different shape of the virus, maybe the way that the virus attacks the cells, binds to cells in the body, maybe something else which makes it replicate more. But whatever the net result is, whatever the cause, the net result is if you or I are infected with that variant compared to a previous variant, we would be more likely to spread that on. So that's what it means by more transmissible. We know, so the suggestions are something like 50 to 70% more transmissible. I saw Matt Hancock was on the MAR program this morning, said 40%. I suspect it's a bit more than 40% increased transmissibility. But the second thing, which I think is more important in the context of the current situation, is it appears to evade some of the immunity conferred by vaccines. And so we're in this situation where it's now clear that really you need two vaccines, you need two doses of vaccines to best prevent being infected with this variant, compared to one dose. Whereas, of course, right at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, if we remember, then the government, MHRA and the JCVI, the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation, made the suggestion that, in fact, there could be a 12-week gap between the two doses of vaccines, and that would maximize the coverage of vaccines in the country. I thought that was a sensible idea at the time. Based on the fact that one dose of vaccine was probably very effective. But what we're seeing now with this variant is that one dose of vaccine seems to be only very partially effective, maybe 30% protective compared to what we thought against previous variants. And so that's the other way that this virus seems to have taken hold. And finally, of those coming into hospital at the moment, the majority of people coming to hospital with this variant have not had immunization, but there are a significant number who've had one dose of vaccine rather than both doses of vaccine. So I think those are the two key ways in which this virus is a worry.
I suppose there's also the issue of long COVID, which is often erased from this conversation, because I suppose a lot of people would look at the fact that thankfully now over 50% of the adult population have two shots, which is great. And that overwhelmingly does cover most older people, most elderly people, and people with underlying health conditions. But when people, I think, often say long COVID, a lot of people shrug and go, well, but actually, I mean, I know lots of people with long COVID. It isn't actually a joke. So I suppose that's the issue, isn't it? That you've got a half the adult population who haven't had two shots. They could be susceptible to that. But also, do we also think, and there seems to be evidence suggesting that the vaccine program is actually effective against long COVID?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally here the problem is the issue is, and this is really comes to why within Independent Sage we've always sort of been arguing of a strategy of towards zero COVID. That doesn't mean that we think, and certainly I don't think, that we will be able to completely eradicate this virus from the world. That's it's very difficult to do, but we recognize that there is a cost to allowing this virus to circulate, even if it's saying, well, it's only in children it's circulating and they don't get ill. It is because of issues such as long COVID. Which of course may occur, or long-term manifestations of COVID that may occur both in people who've had symptoms, but also maybe in people who've not had symptoms. And there is a very low, there's a discrete proportion of children who we know have long-term consequences of COVID, whether or not they had symptoms to start with. Now, long COVID is a sort of broad term, and it is very likely that there are multiple different syndromes or collection of symptoms and causalities of those symptoms under that umbrella. So, for instance, we do know that that one of the reasons why people get very ill with COVID and unfortunately die is that it precipitates small blood clots in blood clots in small blood vessels that mean that there are many organs that can be adversely affected: the kidneys, the heart, the brain, and so forth. And that's actually the cause of much disease within an acute COVID. But of course, the fact that that is a manifestation of COVID means that there will be those who do survive. There may be long-term consequences for that. There's also, of course, those people who do get very ill and have to spend a long time in intensive care. In some cases, we know of people, obviously, that spent 2 or 3 months in intensive care in induced coma. We fully recognize that sort of experience gives long-term, has long-term consequences in terms of slowly getting back to health. And of course, there's the other group of psychological morbidity associated with COVID. So all of those things come within this term long COVID. And I think at this moment in time, it's premature to be absolutely clear about what this is. It is probably a collection of different things. There is evidence. I agree with you that vaccination that prevents infection will prevent those consequences of long COVID. There's some evidence I've seen that vaccination after infection may also be good. It's certainly good for your immune system. So if you've had natural infection and then you have immunization, then your antibody levels go sky high, and you're probably much better protected in the longer term as well from possible reinfection and so on. So it's a complicated picture, but nevertheless something that we need to be looking at in detail. And I think there will be, of course, these consequences going once we have got over the pandemic for the long term.
So you mentioned obviously the 21st of June. So do you think, Independent Sage is saying that shouldn't go ahead. Do you think it will? But I suppose even more depressing for a lot of people, could things actually go backwards? Could you see a scenario where more restrictions are brought in than the current situation we have now?
Well, we issued an emergency statement on Friday at our press conference on Friday. We were sticking our necks out, but really, I think, we were not going against the main scientific consensus. We very much all, I think, agree that it's a very risky time. And of course, the government have all the time talked about, being guided by data, not dates. But as soon as it sort of identified this Midsummer's Day, 21st of June, Freedom Day, whatever, then of course everyone has been focused on that. And unfortunately, expectations are high amongst many parts of the population that things will go back to normal. So we wanted to actually put some caution there and at a relatively early stage, because we think people's expectations should be tempered and be guided by the data. Now, our motivation here is that we don't want to end up having to go into another lockdown. The lockdown that we've been through since early January to last month has been a very significant lockdown. And of course, there's costs to that. There's educational costs, there's social costs, there's mental health costs, as well as cost the economy. So we're driven by the motivation. We don't want there to need to be another lockdown. And therefore, it's not only that we arguing that we should not progress the opening up on the 21st of June, but also we can strengthen other aspects of infection control within society that will minimize ongoing transmissions of infections. So we've identified 6 things. First of all, that we want more support, and we're banging on about this, but far more support for those who are asked to isolate, either because they themselves are infected or because they're in contact with infected individuals. We know that people who are asked to isolate, only about 30–40% do so. And clearly that's to do with the costs to them, usually financial costs, and therefore there needs to be real, much more significant support for that. And that's an essential part of the core bit of infection control. We also want to ensure that schools have better ventilation. We're going into summer term. Children are going back to school tomorrow. Masks should be implemented for secondary school children, and there should be a very rapid assessment and funding of better ventilation. Luckily, we're in summer. It'd be easier to have outdoor activities and so on. We want to stress that. The third thing is that it's the indoor events which we fear most. I mean, transmissions outside are relatively rare, and so we really want to make sure that indoor venues, whether it's schools, whether it's pubs, whether it's clubs, they are assessed for good infection control, good ventilation, and I think that would be the most likely thing to not go ahead on the 21st of June, the indoor events, because of course that is where spread happens. We want to then, with regard to, of course, border controls, which have been really flaky in the UK, and the whole green, amber, red stratification is meaningless, really, because it not only can there be rapid reversals of that, which really leave people in difficulty. Take the Portugal situation, which has moved from green to amber recently. But of course, when you're talking about airports, people flying around the world, just to allocate a country to a certain stratification of red, amber, or green, it does not really deal with people coming through airport hubs, which of course, means that everyone's mixed together. And if someone's coming from Istanbul or Dubai, you haven't got a clue that's where they started their journey or where they were in transit. So we want to strengthen that and a much stronger quarantine situation. And then finally, the vaccine rollout, as we've talked about, but also we want to add that the contribution to global vaccines, we want the G7 UK to really commit, rather than just using words. They really commit to supporting vaccine rollout around the world, because of course we're not just an island. And as we've learned with both the Delta variant coming into the country, but of course our own variants going out to the country. India also has the B117, the Alpha variant there, which originate from the UK. So there's a constellation of activities that we think can be done, should be done, and that will start to help us avoid a future lockdown.
Just lastly, because it's a Sunday and I've gone for a run. It's a bit overcast, but it's still pretty decent weather. Craig Berkey asks what we need to do. Oh, just doesn't ask, just says, but puts it to you. What we need to do is randomize the distribution of the remaining vaccines to give even more protection faster. What do you think about that? I mean, I know I've seen online a lot of younger people, genuine younger people, not people like me who are 36, but people, because at the moment it's over 30s. I think there is talk of lowering next week to 25 plus, which is very exciting. But, as you said, definitely school children clearly are big hubs of transmission, but, there is a lot of the surge in cases is amongst younger people, obvious, because they're congregating together and they're not vaccinated. So what do you think? Do you think we could change the approach of the vaccination program? And also, I did see, though I did Rob Delaney, he's a great comedian. He pointed out that you could now change your second shot appointment and get it earlier because they're trying to reduce the gap to 8 weeks. So I tried that, and unfortunately, I managed to move mine back 2 days. I mean, better than nothing, but that's all it could manage. But I'm just wondering about what your thoughts about both of those things in terms of what we do about the vaccination program going forward.
Yeah, what's really worked well is the fact the vaccination program, I think you've also mentioned this, has been rolled out through the NHS, through existing systems. I was dead scared early on that this would be another thing outsourced like test and trace, but you know, it's made use of NHS systems, and NHS systems work well when there's a clear algorithm. We use the data, we use primary care records. It's this, right? It's the over 65s now it's the 50s to 60s. It's also those with risk factors and so on. And that's contributed to the effectiveness of what's happened, because it allows primary care, who are identifying lists of people to invite in and so forth, to do so in a coherent way. Adding something like randomisation, you know, well, who randomly selects people? What are the systems by which that's going to work? And I think that would just complicate matters to the extent that probably not being the most effective way of rolling out vaccines. So I know that people are missing out at the moment. Younger people are missing out, but nevertheless, the strength, and we all applaud that the rollout program has to some extent been successful because it has been based around very coherent algorithms. It's easy for the NHS to start to deal with.
Oh, and just very lastly, I will let you go, but Craig also asked, do you think the next step could be split, maybe less social distancing outside, even if indoor restrictions are kept?
So I don't think, so there's a couple of things. So I don't think, I think outdoors, you know, being outdoors is safe. Now, of course, that's an easy thing to say, because when you go an outdoor event, you know, if it's a huge event, then of course there are all sorts of indoor spaces that, you know, people get on transport to go to those events and so forth. So I think we've just got to be mindful of that. But I'm much more relaxed about outdoor events. I mean, the last 15 months of the pandemic has shown that the risk of spread outdoors is very little. The problem with outdoor big events is that people have to get there and they have to use public transport. They, you know, indoor things on the way. That's the risk. So I think that's there. And I would just add a little bit, you know, about stratification of people. I heard Tony Blair this morning talking about whether in fact vaccines can actually free up people, and you have the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Unvaccinated can't do this, that, and the other. Vaccinated can do. And I think that would be a disaster, because it would just amplify the inequalities. We're not touched on inequalities so far, but there clearly is an inequity in access to vaccines, and the you know, the wish to take, you know, and hesitancy, and we need to be mindful of that. And the biggest worry, before we finish, the biggest worry I've got is that the next sort of surges will be as a little bit we've seen in Bolton, Blackburn, and so is in really disadvantaged communities. There becomes localized outbreaks amongst multi-generation households where there's less vaccine for whatever reason, comorbidities and so forth. In the same way that we see with tuberculosis now, you know, inequality in health has led to these pockets. And my fear is that becomes the norm. And government can almost wash their hands, say, well, that's your problem. It's a local problem. We don't need to instigate any national policies.
Professor Deenan Pillay, it's been an absolute honour. I've learned a huge amount there, so I hope everyone else also found it, and they did. I can see the comments. People found it extremely educational and informative, very sober and detailed information, which people need. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And the work of you and Independent Sage has been absolutely critical throughout this crisis. And it is worth stating that, because, as I've said, if the advice of people like yourself and Independent Sage had been listened to, we would have still suffered a disaster. But there's a magnitude of disasters, and this country has suffered, of course, the biggest peacetime catastrophe of modern times.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I just say that's a very kind of you to acknowledge Independence Age. The Sun did a hit job on us today, and Toby Young, behind it all, and so on. But I'd far rather your views. So thank you, and your listeners.
A hit job from Toby Young is one of the greatest accolades that any human being can ever aspire to. So you should frame that and consider it to be a great achievement.
Great.
Thank you so much. Take care. And enjoy your Sunday.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Brilliant stuff. Before I bring in James Meadway, who's fantastic. If you're watching live, do click through to YouTube and press the like button. You can use Super Chat to put questions, as we've been reading out, to our next guest as well. Also, I forgot to mention the podcast. Obviously, a lot of you listen. I mean, a huge part of our audience is the podcast, which is going very well indeed. So if wherever you get your podcast from, do download, subscribe, and listen there, because, you might be going for a run, you might be commuting. Every other ways, you don't necessarily want to see maybe you find my face annoying. Maybe my face actively irritates you. Well, you can hide my face by listening to it on the podcast, but we do also really appreciate you watching live and watching the videos. So if my face isn't too objectionable, keep doing that. Our next guest is the brilliant, as I said, James Meadway, who I'm going to bring in right now. Hello, James. Director of the Progressive Economy Forum. Brilliant writer. Do read his writings, New Statesman, elsewhere. If you've not been reading them, sort it out. Google now, James Meadway, New Statesman, e.g. How you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well. You're in Bahrain, actually.
I am in Bahrain. Yes. It's extremely warm.
What's the temperature today in Bahrain?
I've just checked, actually. It's 40 degrees. There you go.
Oh, that's
summer weather.
mean, we're both northerners, plastic northerners, if we're going to be honest, James. And I don't think my Stockport body is not. I struggle with 25. I don't know how you're managing. He's not on holiday, by the way. I should just clarify.
Yeah.
Why is he holidaying in Bahrain?
No, I'm not on holiday in Bahrain. I'm not doing any kind of influencer, go to the Gulf and take pictures of yourself by the pool sort of thing. I'm here because my wife's working here and have been for a while. But it's not the temperature. You get used to it, but not that used to it. And possibly my pink complexion is telling its own story there.
The lighting is protecting you from exposing that. Yeah, so just to kick off, I mean, I suppose one of the things I'm interested in, and I think a lot of people are interested in, is, if we think about, what the lasting, will this be a political economic upheaval? I suppose two words often spring to mind, which is Spanish flu. And the reason I say that is Spanish flu doesn't actually really get, or hasn't really got much of a hearing in history. We have recently spoken more about Spanish flu because gestures wildly at the world. But so-called Spanish flu, which I believe actually first was identified in Utah or something, but because Spain was a neutral country during World War I, reporting restrictions were lifted, and that's why people could speak about Spanish flu. Spanish flu was different, of course. It was influenza. A lot of people actually died of secondary infections because bacterial infections, we didn't have antibiotics. But in any case, it didn't seem to leave much of a impact. That's how it's often portrayed. It was stuck a bit because World War I was there, which just kind of takes a lot of attention. Then you got the rise of fascism in World War II, so maybe it's squeezed a bit. But what do you think? I mean, do you look back at Spanish flu and think, well, actually, the lasting consequences of this pandemic won't be actually that significant, and except for people thinking to themselves, I just never want to think about this ever again, and there won't be the political and economic upheaval people might have thought?
I mean, look, the one that's quite striking with this so far is that most of what's happened looks like a continuation of things that are happening anyway. That if you take from 2008, let's say, and the financial crisis, you see everywhere across the world, governments are more inclined to intervene in the economy in one way or the other. I mean, most obviously to rescue banks, but stretching out a bit, you see the return of industrial strategy, governments deliberately investing in different industries to make them grow. The trade wars that was it broke out between the US and China under Donald Trump, continuing, by the way, under Joe Biden in various different forms. So all of that's like the government is already there in the economy, and what you get with COVID is a massive increase in the government being in the economy in different ways. I mean, most obviously with the lockdown, but also the huge shift in funding towards NHS and health services, towards furlough, that kind of thing. So that's an acceleration of what was happening already. Similar thing with this sort of breakdown of globalization. It was already falling as a share of GDP over the last 10 years or so. Obviously, it's gone off a cliff, certainly in services trade in the last year. So that was already there. So it's kind of an acceleration of a load of things already happening. And that looks like the biggest, most immediate sort of impact from it. And what you have to try and take a view then is whether those things roll back and we just sort of get back to like where we would have been otherwise. Frankly, it doesn't look like it. I mean, it was a very good discussion you just had with Deenan, with the professor there, about the long-term consequences of this and how waves of COVID come and go and what the impact is on the economy. And what it starts to look like is relative to any period of time in certainly the last 70 years, but easily back to 1918, the Spanish flu, you have this kind of permanent medical condition that's now going to act as a constraint on what the economy does. So that even if in your particular part of the world, whether it's New Zealand or up until recently Vietnam or Taiwan, you get rid of COVID, you still have to maintain tight controls on what's going on because the rest of the world hasn't. And that's a big cost. And that changes how your economy operates and can operate. And of course, what you find is after a while, the costs of doing this are great. People want to get rid of the lockdowns, get rid of the restrictions. And lo and behold, you find, as they found in Taiwan and Vietnam, outbreaks popping up and a third wave erupting there. So this is how the thing starts to look into the future, that we're going to end up dealing with this over a long period of time. Therefore, it shapes what the world is like. And that's partly because we live in a more connected world than in 1918. I mean, very, very obviously so. Partly because the way the labour market operates is very different, that you don't have, as you saw in 1918, great chunks of the world. If you look at not quite the majority of victims, but of the sort of 50 million or so people who died from the pandemic in 1918, you'll find 20 million are in British India. And they're basically sort of shoved off over there and just left separate from the rest of the economy. And the thing washes over, kills a huge number of people. And then after a while, you find that, this is why it dies off. You have either people are immune or they're dead. I mean, basically, this is how a pandemic ends up finished. So the impact plays out differently because we have different institutions now, and the kind of form of the disease is different also, of course. This is a disease that, unlike influenza, has a long period of time where people are asymptomatic. You can go around infecting other people, not realise you got it yourself. If you have flu, that period of time is much shorter, so it tends to be a more sort of immediate response to it that anybody has. They know they're ill, they stay at home, they do all these sorts of things. The thing is going to play out differently, is roughly what we're looking at here. The world economy is different. Governments were already intervening more than they used to, and the disease that we're dealing with underneath this looks rather different to things we've seen in the past, or at least compared to Spanish flu, for example.
In terms of the economic consequences, I mean, Britain is one of the worst hit economically of a comparable nation because the geniuses in charge of the country decided that taking tough measures against COVID would damage the economy. So they delayed lockdown 3 times, including Rishi Sunak, who the other week by Boris Johnson's former right-hand man, the Big Dom, he tried to let Rishi Sunak off the hook and basically claimed that Rishi Sunak had got all the calls right. Well, Rishi Sunak brought in lockdown skeptics into number 10 in last autumn to successfully convince the government not to introduce a second lockdown, which they ended up having to do longer, and cases spiraled. And then we got what we saw at Christmas, and the variant. The more the virus is allowed to circulate, the more risk of variants, and we've seen that obviously with devastating consequences. So we have suffered one of the worst economic consequences precisely because we didn't take the tough measures necessary. But I mean, so how bad is the damage in Britain compared to elsewhere? And is it going to lead to scarring in the economy, or actually is what going to happen basically, whether it's whenever we're finally free of restrictions, a load of people, I'm talking middle class people who've been able to save during the pandemic, they're suddenly going to go and splash the cash. That's going to lift the economy, and actually we'll have a big boom as a consequence, and that will reverse the damage. Yeah,
it's worth underlining the point about Rishi Sunak. I mean, something like Eat Out to Help Out was it's hard to think of a more stupid and destructive economic policy in this country's history. I mean, people have done some daft things with the economy before. They've never actively subsidize people getting infected during a pandemic. And we know from the evidence on infections, clear evidence produced by researchers down in Warwick University, that Eat Out to Help Out did lead to an increase in cases. We were paying for people to go and get infected with this during a pandemic. It is absolutely crazy. And it needs to be pinned on Rishi Sunak and the Treasury as an act of gross irresponsibility in the middle of this. If you're talking about the sort of long-term impacts, I mean, what happened last year, you're absolutely right, is this country was walloped by COVID-19 because of a combination of things. I mean, the one you mentioned is important, which is that the delay in lockdown ends up costing you more because you have to do a much harder, heavier lockdown for a longer period of time afterwards. I think also you dig out the Marmot review published at the end of last year by a very eminent public health specialist, Professor Marmot, who looks at the evidence around COVID-19 and makes very clear that 10 years of austerity and existing health inequality meant that we had worse outbreaks in Britain. It was a worse form of disease here because it's an unequal society and you'd applied austerity. So that also adds up eventually to an economic impact as well, because you just get a worse outbreak, which costs you more. So that's all there from last year. What you see for this year is that we got, basically Britain gets the vaccination right. That is due to the NHS above all else. It has very little to do with the government. I mean, the most you can say is they threw some money at it, and that was a good guess. But a country with an NHS and a very good sort of medical research system is likely to be able to do something like the vaccination rollout in the way that has happened. And of course, you find the population in Britain is basically happier about vaccines than many others around the world. There's not much, there is some, but there's not much in the way of sort of anti-vax sentiment out there. So you get this very effective rollout. You're then able to sort of move the economy faster than you might otherwise towards opening up. We can see in the opening up that's taking place right now, just as you saw temporarily last year during the summer, is that once you kind of release things a bit and people go out spending a bit more, the economy recovers, and it's almost automatic. The bit that you throw in on top of this, and the bit that the government's pinning its hopes on, I'll come back to why that isn't quite going to work out like this, is exactly as you say. There's a large number of people who, if you were working at home last year and, okay, you couldn't really go out so much and you weren't going to go on holiday, you end up potentially just saving quite a lot of money. And that quite a lot of money is absolutely, by now, it's about £160 billion stacked up mostly in sort of middle-class bank accounts up and down the country. And the government's basically betting very heavily that this money will turn into spending and that will drive the economy through without them having to intervene very much in what happens. Now, this relies on, first of all, a large amount of that money actually being spent. The best or even the most optimistic sort of survey evidence says that maybe 10% of it is going to get spent. That's from Deutsche Bank. Their sort of estimate on what people are looking to spend in the near future. That's one part of it. The other part of it is, of course, this only happens if people are confident about what's going to happen in the future. Otherwise, they'll sit in the money. And if you go and look at the Bank of England surveys, you find most people saying, actually, I'd rather sit in the money because I'm a bit worried about what's going to happen in the future. If we hit further waves and further restrictions and the reopening process doesn't happen in the way that the government would like it to happen, that in fact we're still having to deal with a global environment for the disease, which means you can't just release everything. You still have restrictions on travel. You still potentially have some restrictions in place in Britain. The economy isn't going to recover like that. And that's when you start to get into the longer term impacts, which is, I think, unlike what you might have seen with big recessions in the past. I mean, you take the 1980s, you get this idea of scarring, that people lose their jobs, often in manufacturing, and they're a bit older, sort of 30s, 40s into their 50s, and it's hard for them to get another job. It's the sort of situation you see kind of, it turns into films, the Full Monty is the sort of classic example of it, that people aren't able to go and get another similar job somewhere down the line. It's difficult to retrain. You get this kind of long-term unemployment that's built up. It probably isn't going to play out quite the same way in that sense with this one. But what you are likely to find, and if you dig out recent publication from the management consultants McKinsey, if you dig out what these people are talking about, is that there are just some jobs in retail and other parts of the economy that depend on kind of human contact is likely to have disappeared. People are doing a lot more shopping online, for example, so there's less demand for high street stores, so there's less demand for people working in them. And if you take that sort of effect, they're talking 2.5 million, they reckon, jobs being churned into the next decade or so. Now that's actually a big sort of economic upset. So that's lots and lots of things happening away underneath in terms of people having to lose their jobs potentially and move somewhere else. That looks like a long-term impact from all of this, and that's something that potentially also drags on growth into the future. And instead of the rosy sort of picture the government and its supporters are trying to paint, we get something that looks unfortunately a lot bleaker for absolutely everyone.
I was very interested in a tweet you tweeted, obviously, a couple of days ago, I think, and it was in response to the it was yesterday, the settlement, the international agreement on corporation tax, agreeing a global fall, and about how this represents, how this showed, we're looking at the death of neoliberalism. So I'm interested in, because obviously that's partly linked to the current crisis and what that means for, obviously it's slightly bleak on one level that we have a conservative government. Well, it's bleak on every level that we have a conservative government in this country because and an opposition party that's failing to do its job, but offer a coherent vision. Because in World War II, obviously you had the Labour Party, which said, when we win the war, we've got to win the peace, and this is what the peace is going to look like, and we're going to transform society. In this national emergency, the Labour Party, well, it's not really offering, it's not saying anything, it's just there somehow. But I'm interested in that, because obviously, the US left, the kind of insurgency of the US left over the last few years has had an impact in American politics and the center of gravity politically within the Democrats. But what do you mean? Just tell us what you think in terms of that international agreement and how it links into, of course, the crisis, the economic crisis linked to COVID, and where you think it's heading in terms of a new settlement.
Well, this is a key moment in the whole thing. People sometimes, if you talk about neoliberalism, and it's a sort of the rules of the economic game that we've all kind of lived under for probably 40 odd years in this country, really since Thatcher, maybe a bit before that, but really since Thatcher, that says, markets are the best way to run society. Big corporations should be allowed to do what they want. Don't tax rich people too much, because if you do, they won't create so many jobs. I mean, that kind of set of almost common sense rules that we all sort of deeply ingested and understand well, and that governments of all colours, including Labour in the last time it was in government, basically adhered to that way of thinking about how the economy operates. A key part of that was you should not be taxing corporations too heavily, because that will detract or take money away from them investing and creating jobs and delivering growth for everybody else. I mean, that's a sort of core neoliberal proposition. And what you see for about 40 years is that, led actually by the US, but pulled along by the appearance, this massive use actually of tax havens across the world, you get a kind of race to the bottom in taxes on corporations. Every big economy, loads and loads of smaller economies, basically everyone starts trying to cut the amount of taxes they're applying to corporations there. And it's tax havens are a key part of that, because once you have corporations, particularly if you look at the big tech, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, the companies that are really able to don't really operate with obvious physical factories. So it's relatively easy for them to say, oh, actually, we made our money in some tax haven. Actually, all these profits come from Bermuda. Would you believe it? That kind of thing. They can really cut the amount of taxes they face. And that removes, of course, resources that governments would otherwise have. Now, for 40 years, you basically had this race to the bottom taking place. Britain continued at the leading edge of it. The new Labour government cut corporation tax again and again and again. The coalition government, the Tory Liberal coalition government, the Tories again cut corporation tax. So to suddenly get in place this agreement, which is not that sudden, it's been sort of brewing for a while, but to get this agreement in place amongst the G7, the sort of most of the biggest economies in the world, excluding China and a few others that are now growing very rapidly and are very large. But to get that agreement with them on what a minimum tax rate would look like for corporations is a huge turn. I mean, it's a real reverse of what's happened in the last 40 years. So if I say neoliberalism is dying, I mean, this is a big turn against it. And it's one that's happening not just in the national economies, like in this country, this government is doing something different. This is one that's now a coordinated turn among some of the biggest economies on the planet. And it's likely the G20, the sort of next set of big economies, is going to agree to it, and then potentially the OECD later in the year. So it's important. Now, the actual level of taxation proposed is only 15%. Biden administration originally said 25%. But even to get to that minimum is a step in a different direction to where you're going. It should be higher. There should be more money from corporations going to government so you can spend it on the things that we need. But because that turn has happened, it doesn't look to me like the old way of running the world, the old rules of the game, are being applied in quite the same way, that things are a moment of flux for us. And it could go in a good way. I think this step in taxation is a good, positive thing. I think some of what the Biden administration is doing, talking about reinforcing and expanding trade union rights. And this is, again, it's not happened in the US for 40 years. That's a good, positive step. And then you see elements of it that are clearly, completely detrimental to that. That lots of demands for permanent restrictions on the movement of people, more border controls, more surveillance at work, all sorts of different ways in which this can play out that are not necessarily neoliberal in the way we'd normally recognise it, as in corporations and the free market are making the running here, but involve the state trying to shape the economy in different ways. And it's an open-ended process as to whether that is mostly a good thing or mostly a bad thing. And that's what we need to fight for.
Lastly, and then I can leave you to your 40 centigrade degree heat. Zero COVID is something which some on the left have called for. I know some of the Socialist Campaign Group MPs, that's the left parliamentary bloc within the Labour Parliamentary Labour Party. It's not going to happen, is it? I mean, it's this idea as well. I mean, for those who don't know what zero COVID is, I think it's self-explanatory. It's obviously the eradication of the virus. But the economic, the costs of trying to do that are so immense, and it would have to be globally executed. Because isn't the problem now that countries which did get to near zero COVID are struggling because other countries aren't near zero COVID?
Exactly.
And unless you ban people from traveling ever again, which I think we all agree is not feasible, we can't really do it. So actually, we're going to have to, focus on mass vaccination in order to, and then we're going to be stuck with it as a like flu or the cold that you either get. If you feel under the weather, it's either COVID, the flu. You get booster shots. Yeah. I'm babbling. What do you think?
No, I think that's basically the case here. The issue with thinking that zero COVID is a sustainable strategy for any country is that you have to then try and think that every other country is going to do it as well. And what you've got, because we live in a competitive global economy, a capitalist economy, what you have is lots and lots of countries and companies who are close to those national states, all looking at how they gain an advantage on anybody else. That's how capitalism operates. It's a competitive system. So if you say, okay, domestically, we're going to apply zero COVID, that can look for a short period of time quite good. You can sort of run an economy like this for a period of time, maintaining tight controls on borders and things. So it depends what your economy is like. If you have, for instance, one of the busiest airport hubs in the world sit in the middle of your economy, then imposing those tight restrictions is always going to impose a certain amount of cost. I mean, that's what Britain has with Heathrow. That you can try and maintain this, but the cost is great. The fact that you're restricting really what people have to do quite substantially by this point, we've been through lockdown. It's not pleasant to do this. There's a demand to get rid of the thing. So there's a real pressure to remove it faster, and certainly before the rest of the world has got COVID under control. And that's what you see happening in Taiwan and Vietnam are the two that sort of stick out at the minute. They dealt with it last year. They had a kind of zero COVID or very close to zero COVID policy. And it did involve tight controls over who goes in and out. Same thing in New Zealand, extremely tight border controls. Who goes in and out, lockdowns and all kinds of forms of social distancing, and you maintain it. And then they got the vaccination, then they released, and then suddenly you get this sort of upsurge in cases. In Vietnam, not had the vaccination in practice. So that's the problem with saying you're going to be able to do this. That you can try this, but you need everyone else to do this. And if you have a global system that's really bad at coordinating things, that isn't going to happen. You're not going to get coordinated zero COVID, because obviously if you're a country, if everybody else is doing zero COVID and you as a country aren't, you don't need to. Because why would you? Everyone else can do the cost of zero COVID. You just do nicely out of the fact that everybody else is trying to do zero COVID. So you won't do it. And that same logic applies to everyone. So no one does it in the end. That's where we end up. A similar thing goes with vaccines, unfortunately. If we want to think about vaccine hesitancy, it's an issue in Britain. It is, and it is a problem. But it's not the thing that's going to undermine the progress of vaccination globally. The problem with vaccination globally is that at this point in time, about 2% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa has got the vaccine. The COVAX program, set up by the World Health Organization to distribute vaccines across the world, already inadequate, by the way, has basically collapsed. The vaccines aren't turning up to be distributed. So we're not going to get an effective vaccination program unless we get everybody vaccinated. And to do that is a massive logistical challenge of a kind that humanity in general, I don't think, has ever completed. And we have a social system that's really not designed to solve problems like this. It's never had to do it before. It's based in competition. It's not going to willingly try and do that. Now, the IMF have a proposal out this week for a £50 billion global program on trying to get 40% of the world vaccinated by the end of next year or so. It's pretty ambitious already. It's not totally adequate, but it's already ambitious. Even getting to that is going to be a challenge. So unfortunately, you end up being quite pessimistic about what the prospects are for COVID in general, for the British economy in particular, because the general setup of the thing is we're going to be stuck with this some period of time, at least in part, because although we have the tools and the technology to actually handle this, which is basically mass vaccination in the first instance, we have a global system that isn't able to handle this.
James, thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground there, which is absolutely fantastic, and really, really appreciate it. Stay safe out there in Bahrain. You're on a lockdown now, aren't you? Yeah,
that's right. Yes. But as of last week, as cases have surged, despite vaccination in this case, it's not good.
That's not ideal. Well, that's a cheery note to end it on.
Sorry, yes.
But really appreciate it, and do follow James on Twitter. He is Meadway, as in his last name, but with a J, because he's called James. So it's MEADWAJ. So do follow him, because he's always very insightful and full of interesting ideas and perspectives, which is what we like. So cheers, James. Really appreciate it, and I will see you.
Cheers,
I don't know when.
See
you soon. Yeah, exactly. Take care, buddy. Take care, mate.
See ya.
Two brilliant guests. That was exceptionally informative and educational. I've learned a huge amount. Don't go yet before I finish. Oh yeah, by the way, if you're watching live, do like the video. Helps other people watch it, because most people don't watch this live. And do subscribe. And the podcast. I'm obsessed now with evangelizing about the podcast, because it's doing so well. So many people are listening to it. So this will go out on the podcast, so you can listen to this wherever you are, whenever you want. And we do have a lot of very good stuff coming up. For example, I mean, we're nothing if not eclectic. We've got Will Young next week talking about his new book, How to Be a Gay Man. We've got I'm Alex, the YouTube sensation, on, and I'm also doing a video in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Eclectic. But also, we've got a documentary coming out, but we haven't decided what the documentary is, because we have to sift through all the ideas people have sent. If you sign up on Patreon, .com/Jones84, we've got loads of we've asked people what documentaries should we make, because we keep doing documentaries that people ask us to do. That's why we did the Hartlepool one. It's why we did this video about companies profiting from COVID. So basically, if you sign up, you can help us decide what we do, who we talk about. We've got loads of great interviewees coming up on a whole range of different issues. They're always very eclectic. I mean, if I look at our latest interviews, for example, just bringing it up, what a professional I am as I faff around with my computer. Yeah, so for example, our latest interviews, we have Paris Lees talking about the war on trans people, Ed Miliband. We've had Bashar Murad, who is a gay Palestinian activist. We've had Ian Lavery, the left-wing Labour MP, as well as Rebecca Long-Bailey, another left-wing Labour MP. We've had Sadiq Khan. We've had Robert Lindsay. We've had Jamie Carragher. We've had JJ Bowler talking about toxic masculinity. We've had Michael Rosen. We've had Abigail Thorne. We've had Claire Fox. We've had Naomi Klein. We've had Alexei Sale. We've had the leader of the Green Party, Paul Krugman. We've had a lot of. It's very eclectic. So do check out those interviews, and also you can listen to them on the podcast, or you can watch them. And on the if you sign up on Patreon, you just send us ideas who to interview, because a lot of those people are people we have been suggested. The other thing before we go, this book's come out. I've done a chapter here. It's a really, really good book called We Can Do Better Than This. It's edited by Amelia Abraham, who's fantastic. And it is a book about the future of LGBTQ plus rights. And it includes people like me, unfortunately, but also Ollie Alexander, who you might have seen in It's a Sin. He's also the singer of Years and Years. Phil Apoku Gimia, Dr. Phil. She's just an absolutely incredible trailblazer. Peppermint, Beth Ditto, so many. I wrote about LGBTQ plus mental health and what we can do about that. We've had others like Sean Fay, my friend, who's been on the show, talking about trans influencers. Juliet Jakes, another brilliant writer, talking about transphobia and the UK media. There's essays on dating, love and the family, health and social care, beyond the binary, safety, visibility. These are all the kind of sections, community and organizing. Anyway, do get this book. We can do better than this. Not for me, but because of the other brilliant people on it. As I've said, we've got loads coming up. I've now got to take my cat Keir to the vet. He's been a bit peaky, so he's been fed antibiotics, which I'm incapable of delivering, so the vet's going to do it. Someone says, my guests are eclectic, but only if left wing. Not true, amigo. The people I've interviewed include Peter Hitchens, Claire Fox, who I mentioned. She's not left wing. She's a Brexit Party member of the House of Lords. And also, we've got some other right-wing guests coming up, actually. So, no. That's enough for me. I'm going to go and put my cat in this carrier case. He doesn't like it. He gets very upset. Lots of love, everyone. I will see you very soon. We're live next Sunday at 12 o'clock. Do support us, as I've said, on Patreon if you can. We've got this documentary coming up and all these interviewees. Woohoo! Lots of love, everyone. Have a great Sunday or whatever day it is when you're watching or listening to this. See you soon.